This is LSAT Prep Test 154, Section 3, Passage 1. This is about Great Zimbabwe and what actually made it powerful. It's a fairly easy passage, but there's one trap that catches a lot of students, and I'm going to get to that. Now, this is a social science passage. The author here is picking a fight with the standard scholarly explanation. The main point is that scholars credit gold for Great Zimbabwe's success, but the author says they've got it backwards and it was actually cattle. Now, the paragraph you've got to care the most about is paragraph 2. That is where the entire argument is, but I'll walk you through how we get there. Now, paragraph 1 is a setup with a twist at the end. You get the background first. Great Zimbabwe was powerful, politically centralized, and wealthy enough to import luxury goods from overseas. Then you get the scholarly explanation. All of that came from controlling gold on that plateau and exporting it to the coast. Sounds pretty solid, but that is the trap, because right at the very end of the paragraph, the author drops the however and says actually, it's the agricultural system that matters the most. And that one sentence is the entire thesis of the passage. If you were reading it on autopilot, you probably treated paragraph 1 as pure background, but it's not. The author just told you their entire position, so go back and find the word however if you missed it the first time. Now, paragraph 2 is pretty long, and every sentence in it is doing real work. Don't skim this one. The author needs to convince you that a cattle economy wasn't just a different food source, it was the thing that created Great Zimbabwe's entire political structure. And the way the argument works is like a chain. It starts with a problem. The city had maybe 10,000 people, and that is huge for this region and time period. Normal crop farming couldn't support that. The soil needed long breaks between plantings. You couldn't haul grain because there were no carts or draft animals, and you couldn't stockpile it either. And so those are 3 different reasons why crops fail as an explanation. Each one closes a door, and then the author opens the only door left, cattle. But here's where it gets good. The cattle economy was not simple. Herds needed massive grazing land. They had to move seasonally, higher ground in summer, lower ground in winter, because of disease from the tsetse fly. Now, you can't run an operation like that without serious coordination, and serious coordination means centralized control, which means a ruling class, which means the cattle end up belonging to that ruling class. So you see here how each step forces the next one. That is the author's entire opinion. That's their argument. Cows don't just feed people, cows create kings. Now, you want to read paragraph 2 slowly. If you rush it, you're going to remember the facts but miss the chain, and the chain is what the questions are going to ask you about. Now, paragraph 3 does 2 things, and the second one is sneaky. First, it shows how deep the ruling class's control went. Ordinary people only got cattle as a gift from royalty. Cattle were required for marriage contracts, so the royal class had power over the most basic parts of daily life. That part is pretty straightforward. The sneaky part comes at the end. The passage circles back to gold, and what the author does here is brilliant. The author doesn't say gold mining didn't happen. The author says gold mining only happened because of cattle. The actual mining was dangerous, the yields were small, and the work wasn't worth it on its own. Royalty had to offer cattle to get laborers to do it. And so the thing scholars point to as the cause of Great Zimbabwe's power was actually a product of the cattle system. Now, that is the key move. Gold doesn't explain cattle. Cattle explains gold. The author flips the cause and effect. Now, here is the trap. A lot of students walk away from this passage thinking the author is saying gold didn't matter, but that's not it. The author is saying gold was real, but secondary. It depended on something deeper. If you pick a choice that says the author dismisses gold mining or thinks it was unimportant, that's too strong. The author's opinion is about what came first and what made everything else possible. Now, the other mistake students make here is reading this as a description, like it's just a tour of an ancient economy. This is an argument with a clear structure. Here's what people think, here's why they're wrong, and here's what actually explains it. If you miss the core of the argument, every question is going to be harder. Now, before you go to the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, can you explain why the author spends so much time on why crop farming failed. Second, can you trace the chain from cattle to political power in your own words? And third, why does the author bring gold back at the very end instead of dropping it after paragraph 1? So that was passage 1. You can access all of the passages in your LSAC Law Hub account. I can't display them on screen, unfortunately, due to copyright. We don't want to get sued or shut down here, and so you'll have to access the passages themselves there, but I'm trying to give you a guidepost as to where to look for them. So that was passage 1. On to passage number 2. This is LSAT PrepTest 154, section 3, passage 2. This is a comparative or dual passage set. The topic is whether falsehood belongs in writing. This is a medium difficulty question. Not because the ideas are necessarily hard, but because the two passages look like they agree more than they actually do. Both authors here defend inaccuracy. That is your surface level read, but they are defending totally different kinds of inaccuracy in totally different genres with totally different levels of confidence. And if you miss those gaps, you're going to treat the passages as being interchangeable, and the questions definitely won't let you get away with that. Now, passage A is about historical fiction. The author gets right to it. You can't write good historical narratives without making things up, because period-accurate dialogue would be unreadable. You've got to invent conversations. You've got to fill gaps the record doesn't cover, and the author is not apologizing for any of this. They're stating it like it's obvious. Then comes the move that matters the most in passage A. The author separates lies from mistakes. A lie is intentional and purposeful. A mistake is accidental and unforgivable. And so the question is not whether a detail is accurate. The question is whether the inaccuracy is doing something useful. Accurate equals good is way too simple, and that's the whole point. Then the second half of passage A adds a limit, then immediately brushes past it. They say, sure, some lies go too far. But then the author spends only one sentence on that and pivots straight to Shakespeare. Shakespeare, of course, distorted facts on purpose. The result was drama that people still remember. You want to read that section fast because the Shakespeare example is just proof of the argument, not actually a new idea. Now, the tone of the passage here is steady, confident, straightforward, no second guessing. File that away. Passage B is an autobiographer, and the tone shifts immediately. The author is astonished at their own unreliable memory. They know a memory is wrong. They can hold both versions in their head at once. But the false version is more vivid, it's more emotionally real. And that opening section is doing something sneaky. It's building sympathy before the argument even starts. So you're already kind of nodding along with them before the author asks you to even accept anything. But then the argument lands. If the actual events don't capture the emotional experience, the writer has to choose. And if a false memory feels more true than the real one, maybe it carries its own kind of truth. The author calls it a subjective truth, an emotional truth. You want to slow down there. That phrase is the entire philosophical foundation for everything that follows. Now, here's where passage B gets really interesting. The author says lying is basically unavoidable in autobiography. And then it goes further. Leaving out emotionally powerful false memories might actually be more misleading than including them. And that is a pretty bold claim, and the author knows it. Because right after making that case, the author then turns on themselves. They say their argument has grown strained and their tone shrill. They are unhappy with where their own logic has taken them. Now, this is the moment that separates strong students from everybody else. Most people read that admission and think the author is backing down, but they're not. They still hold the position, they just don't love holding it. In other words, there is a difference between changing your mind and being uncomfortable with your conclusion. Now, the very end of passage B draws a line between autobiography and journalism. The trust a reader brings to an autobiography is different. It's not about factual accuracy. Autobiography sits on what the author calls the middle ground between fact and fiction. Different writers will land in different spots on that ground. Now, here's the key move. Both passages say falsehood can be valid, but passage A treats it as a craft decision. The writer chooses to distort facts to improve the story. It's deliberate. It's a tool. Passage B treats it as something the writer is stuck with. Memory is unreliable. The distortion happens whether you want it to or not. One author is in the driver's seat, the other one is a passenger. And the confidence gap matters just as much. Passage A never flinches, passage B flinches repeatedly. And that difference in tone is absolutely going to show up in at least one question. Now, the main trap is flattening these two passages into the same position. A student who walks into the questions thinking both authors are fine with lying is going to get burned. The test will ask how they differ. It's going to ask what one author would say about the other's situation. And if you can't separate the tool from the condition, you're going to pick answers that sound close but miss the distinction. Now, you want to watch for questions that put the two authors in conversation. Passage A's author would probably tell Passage B's author to stop agonizing and just own the distortion. Use it on purpose. Passage B's author would probably say, that's fine when you're writing fiction, but autobiography doesn't give you that luxury. You don't get to choose which memories feel real. Also, keep an eye on that word trust at the end of Passage B. The author distinguishes between the trust you bring to autobiography and the trust you bring to a newspaper article. And that distinction is a natural spot for a question. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you know three things. First, what is the difference between a lie and a mistake in Passage A, and why does the author care about that distinction? Second, why does the Passage B author admit their own argument feels strained, and does that admission change their position? And third, if both authors were in the same room, what would they actually disagree about? So that was Passage 2. We're going to move on to Passage 3 for those just joining. I do my regular live streams every single weekday, same place, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and so on. My regular lives are at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific. During those, I do open Q&A on anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions. I'll be live in about 2.5 hours for that live stream. This one's a bit different. I'm working through every single actual official LSAT reading comprehension passage. My goal is to create a comprehensive set of explanations covering every single reading comp passage ever. So we're working through them together bit by bit live on daily live streams in addition to the regular Q&As. So this is a separate extra bonus live stream that you're getting access to for free. I'm going to move on to passage number 3 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 154, Section 3, Passage 3. This is about cholera bacteria and a microbiologist named Rita Coldwell. Pretty easy passage because the structure is straightforward and the author reveals their position early. But you don't want to let that fool you into lazy reading because the trap on this one is subtle. Of course, this is a science passage. The author is telling the story of one researcher proving the entire field wrong. The main point is that cholera bacteria can survive on their own in water, and the only reason nobody knew that is because the detection methods couldn't find them. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 2. It's the longest, it carries almost all the evidence, and the questions are going to pull from it heavily, so we'll spend the most time there. Paragraph 1 gives you the old view. For about 100 years, everyone believed cholera bacteria only traveled through people. Human waste got into food or water, people got sick, and that was the whole cycle. But there was a problem that nobody could solve. The bacteria kept disappearing between outbreaks. Then cholera would show up years later in places where it was supposedly gone. And that is the mystery the whole passage exists to answer. Your job in paragraph 1 is simple. Understand the old belief and understand the hole in it. You don't want to slow down here, this is just set up. But then there's paragraph 2, which is where everything happens, so you do want to slow down here. Caldwell shows up claiming she found cholera bacteria in the Chesapeake Bay, and the scientific community basically laughed at her. Why? 2 reasons. First, nobody thought the bacteria could live outside a human host. And 2, there were 0 cholera outbreaks near the Chesapeake, so on paper her claim made no sense. But here's where the paragraph turns. Caldwell didn't just insist she was right. She had a theory for why nobody else had found what she found. She thought the bacteria were there all along, but that the standard method, growing cultures in a petri dish, simply could not detect them. So she used something different. She used an antibody test that makes the bacteria glow under ultraviolet light. She tested water from bayous near New Orleans where people had gotten cholera from eating crab, and the bacteria were there. And then comes the knockout punch. In Asia, the antibody test found bacteria in 51 out of 52 water samples. The culture methods, only 7 out of the same 52. So there was a complete failure using the old tool. And that contrast is the backbone of the entire passage. It doesn't just prove Caldwell right, it explains why everybody else missed it. They were wrong about the test. So you've got to walk out of paragraph 2 understanding that one thing. The argument isn't just that the bacteria are in the water, it's that the bacteria were always there and we couldn't see them because we were looking the wrong way. Then paragraph 3 explains the science behind why the old method failed. The bacteria go dormant, they shrink, they stop reproducing. And if they're not reproducing, you can't grow them in a culture. Caldwell calls this viable but non-culturable. That just means alive but invisible to the old tests. Now that phrase will almost certainly show up somewhere in the questions. Then the end of the passage gets speculative. Caldwell notices that cholera outbreaks in South Asia line up with seasonal changes in ocean temperature. If the bacteria are sitting in the water the whole time, maybe temperature or salinity changes are what wake them up. But notice how the author pulls back here. You get, if Caldwell believes, and it is possible. They're hedging. The author is with Caldwell on the main claim, but this last piece is presented as an open question, not a conclusion, so you don't want to treat it as proven. The questions might offer you an answer choice that overstates this. Now, you want to read paragraph 3 at a moderate pace. The dormancy explanation matters. The temperature stuff at the end is supporting detail. Now, the key move here is the gap between what's actually in the water and what the old detection method could find. That's what every hard question on this passage will circle back to. Now, the author fully supports Caldwell. After the initial skepticism from other scientists, there is not a single word of pushback. Every paragraph after the opening stacks evidence in her favor. The big trap is confusing the skepticism in paragraph 2 with the author's own position. The author is describing what the other scientists believed, then spending the rest of the passage demolishing it. So if you read that skepticism as the author's view, you're going to blow any question about the author's attitude or the passage's main point. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you know 3 things. First, why couldn't traditional methods detect the bacteria? Second, what does viable but non-culturable actually mean? And third, what is the 51 out of 52 versus 7 out of 52 comparison doing in the argument? Not what it says, but why it's there. So that was passage 3. We're going to move on to passage 4 now. For those just joining, by the way, I am actually offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now or later. You can book your free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. Now, this is LSAT Prep Test 154, Section 3, Passage 4, about international environmental law. Specifically, whether environmental principles actually qualify as customary international law. This is a medium difficulty passage, but the argument itself is pretty straightforward. The problem here is the vocabulary trips you up if you let it. Now, this is a law passage. The author is tearing something down. The main point is that scholars are wrong to treat environmental principles as norms of customary international law. Those principles don't meet the standard, so scholars should focus on treaties instead. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 3. That's where the author reclassifies what these norms really are. Everything before it builds up to that moment. Everything after it follows from that. Now, paragraph 1 is pure setup with no argument yet. It tells you there are no international statutes banning nations from causing environmental damage to each other. So scholars go looking for customary international law, legal principles that are not written in any statute, but show up in how nations actually behave. Then you get 2 examples, the duty to prevent transboundary harm and the precautionary principle. Now, you don't need to memorize the specifics here, just register that there are 2, and they both sound perfectly reasonable. And that reasonableness matters, because the author is going to pull the rug out from you later, and it only works if you bought in here. So you want to move through this at a pretty normal speed. Then paragraph 2 is the setup for the takedown. First, you get the test. How do scholars decide if something counts as a norm of customary international law? Nations have to actually follow the principle, not just talk about it. They have to actually do it. Now watch what happens here. The author says these environmental principles fail that test. Nations don't follow them. Pollutants cross borders constantly, and nations rarely even try to fix it. So by the scholar's own criteria, these principles don't qualify. Now, this is the paragraph where you've got to slow down. The gap between the standard and the reality is doing all the heavy lifting. And if you skim this, paragraph 3 is not going to land. Now, paragraph 3 is where fast readers lose points. And now here's why. You would expect the argument to be done because the principles fail the test, case closed. But the author goes further. Nations don't follow these norms, yet they still claim to support them. And then the author catches the scholars in a contradiction. Scholars say they evaluate norms based on what nations do. But look at their actual debates. They are based on what nations say. That is a totally different thing. Now, here comes the move you can't miss. The author reclassifies these so-called norms. They are not legal standards at all. They are an ideological system, meaning a set of shared ideals that nations use to defend their own behavior and attack other countries. That word ideological is doing massive work. It strips these principles of any legal authority. If you read paragraph 3 and still think the author views these as real legal norms, you're going to get the hardest questions wrong. Now, paragraph 4 is the prescription. It moves fast. Scholars chasing customary international law for environmental cases are wasting their time. Treaties and direct negotiations are how these disputes actually get resolved. So, study that instead. The author even gets specific. Look at how environmental principles can contribute to treaty formation. You want to read this at full speed. There is no surprises here. It's the logical endpoint. Now, the key move is the gap between what nations do and what nations say. The author weaponizes that gap to disqualify these principles as legal norms and reclassify them as ideology. That is what the hardest questions will test. Now, this passage is not about whether environmental protection matters. It's about whether scholars are using the right category to study it. And that is the wrong frame most students fall into here. You read phrases like transboundary harm and precautionary principle, and you start thinking about the environment. But the author doesn't care about the environment here. The author cares about legal classification. If you get pulled into the substance of the principles instead of the argument about their status, you're going to pick wrong answers on main point and attitude questions every single time. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you know these 3 things. First, why do the principles fail the test for customary international law? Second, what does the author think they actually are, if not legal norms? And third, what does the author want scholars to do differently? So that was passage 4. We're going to move on to the next exam now in PrepTest 153. So this is going to be PrepTest 153, section 3. We'll work through passages 1 through 4 here. And by the way, folks, for those wondering, I will be doing the regular live in about 2.5 hours. Live Q&A, anything LSAT and admissions, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific. I do those every day. These reading comp explanation lives are a bonus live in addition to the regular ones, not instead of them. We're working through every single reading comp passage ever. So this is PrepTest 153, section 1, passage 1. This is about film criticism and why it's been ignoring a huge problem. Fairly easy passage. But you don't want to be sloppy or lazy here because there is one move in this passage that catches folks off guard. Now, this one is a humanities passage. The author's main point is that film critics analyze films without asking a basic question. Which version of the film did the audience actually see? Now, the most important paragraph here is the last one. Paragraphs 2 and 3 are evidence. Passage 4 is the argument. That is where the author explains why this problem exists and why it matters. If you read paragraphs 2 and 3 carefully and cruise through past paragraph 4, you're going to get the questions wrong. So paragraph 1 does one thing. It opens up a gap. All the writing about film, the serious academic kind, has been abstract. Critics study structure, aesthetics, and audience effects, but they haven't looked at something obvious. What does the audience actually end up watching? The author says external factors get between the filmmaker's intent and the viewer's experience. Now, that word actually is doing work. It tells you the author thinks critics have been living in a fantasy version of film. You want to read this at normal speed. It's the promise of the passage. Everything after it is delivery. Now, paragraph 2 is the first piece of evidence. Distribution messes with films. You get bad subtitles, you get dubbing, which the author calls more profound because the film gets re-edited. And you get retitling, where they give a film a completely new name that has nothing to do with the original. And that last detail is easy to blow past and overlook, but the author is making a specific point here. A new title doesn't just mislabel the film, it changes what the viewer expects before they press play. And so the damage there is starting before you even watch. You want to read this part fast because it's just a list. You want to grab the point and keep moving. The point is, films get changed on the way to the audience. Paragraph 3 does the same thing but turns it up even louder. Television and video do the worst damage. You lose image quality. Ads chop the film into pieces. Station logos sit on top of the picture. Announcers talk over the soundtrack. And the sneaky one is networks speed up the projection to fit more commercials in. And the author says that is almost imperceptible. Think about what that means. Some of the damage is invisible. The viewer doesn't even know the film has been changed. That's a different kind of problem than bad subtitles, because you can spot bad subtitles, but you can't really spot a film running 3% too fast. Still, you want to read this paragraph carefully and quickly, because it's more evidence for the same claim. Now, don't memorize the examples, just know that TV is the worst offender and that some damage is hidden. Then you want to slow down. Paragraph 4 is where the passage focuses the questions. The author asks why everyone, both audiences and critics, have just accepted all of this. And the answer has to do with the fact that what makes film different from other art forms is that in painting, everyone knows a reproduction is not the real painting. A poster of the Mona Lisa is not the Mona Lisa. But film doesn't work like that. Film is exactly reproducible. Under ideal conditions, every print of a film is the work itself, not a copy, but the actual work. And that distinction is the main idea of the entire passage, because if every copy should be the real thing, people assume every copy is the real thing. And that assumption lets the damage go unnoticed. Then the author gives you two consequences. First, critics who review altered versions are being unfair to filmmakers because they're judging a version the filmmaker never made. Second, critics who review the original, clean version may set expectations that don't match what viewers actually see. Either way, the criticism fails because it's disconnected from reality. Now, the key move is that comparison between film and other art forms. The reproducibility of film is what should protect it. Every copy should be identical. But it's also what hides the problem, because people stop checking. The author's stance here is that film criticism has a blind spot, and it comes from a wrong assumption about what audiences are watching. The main trap is treating this as a passage about technology. It's not about how TV ruins movies, it's about why critics don't notice or don't care. So if you read this as a passage saying technology is bad, you're going to choose wrong answers on main point and attitude questions. Because the right answers are about criticism, not about broadcast equipment. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, why does the author bring up painting and other art forms? What point does that comparison set up? Second, what are the two specific consequences the author names at the end? And third, why does the author think film's nature as a reproducible medium actually makes the problem worse, not better? So that was passage 1 in PrepTest 153. On to passage 2. This is LSAT PrepTest 153, section 1, passage 2, about fish farming, specifically whether it helps or hurts wild ocean fisheries. This is medium difficulty because the passage looks balanced, but it's not. And that gap between how it looks and what it's actually doing is where the hard questions are. Now, this is a science passage. The author is building a case that fish farming mostly makes the overfishing problem worse, even though it sounds like a fix. Now, the most important paragraph is the first one. It's where the author shows you exactly what they think. Everything after it is just evidence. Paragraph 1, starts with setup you can move through quickly. Fish farming is booming, it doubled in a decade, and it already produces a quarter of the fish people eat. Fine, that's all background. But then you hit the expert claim that fish farming will actually restore wild fish populations. The author immediately kills it after that. They say little, if any, evidence. You want to stop on those 4 words. It's not a gentle disagreement, it is a dismissal. If you read past that phrase too fast, you're going to spend the rest of the passage thinking the author is open to the idea, but they're not. Then at the very bottom of the paragraph, you get the paradox statement. Fish farming is both a possible solution and a contributing factor to the decline. Now, this looks like a balanced thesis, 2 sides evenly weighted. But here's what you've got to notice. The author just spent 2 sentences saying the upside has no evidence. So the possible solution, half of that paradox, is already on thin ice before paragraph 2 even starts. Read this at a normal speed, but then hit the brakes at the end, because that paradox sentence is your map for the entire passage. Paragraph 2 is the environmental damage argument. Pollution, waste, pathogen spreading, non-native species escaping into the ocean. You don't have to memorize all that, of course, but what you need to catch is where the paragraph lands. The very last phrase ties all of it back to wild fishery stocks. Every problem in this paragraph circles back to the same idea. Fish farming damages the thing it is supposed to protect. You want to keep a steady pace here because this is evidence for a point already made. It's not a new idea. Then paragraph 3 is the feed problem, and it's pretty sneaky. Farming most fish species requires massive amounts of wild fish as input, almost 2 kilograms of wild fish for every 1 kilogram of farmed fish. For carnivores like salmon, you need up to 5. So you're burning through wild fish to support producing farmed fish. That is not a solution. That is a new problem. Then the passage throws you a bone. 3 species, catfish, milkfish, and carp, have a better ratio. And defenders of fish farming say wild predators eat even more than farmed ones do. But you want to watch how much space these defenses get. They only get 1 sentence each. And then the 5 kilogram number drops and buries both of them. The author is not presenting a fair debate here. They are letting the other side talk just long enough to knock it down. So if you treat those counterpoints as real balance in the passage, you're going to get the attitude wrong. You want to slow down here. The numbers are important. Then paragraph 4 is the trap paragraph. It starts with a genuine concession. Fish farming can lower prices. It can reduce investment in fishing fleets. Tilapia and catfish can sub for ocean fish like cod. And that all sounds like good news. And it is good news for about 4 sentences. Then the word nonetheless comes in and takes it all back. Niche markets for wild-caught fish are growing, and people still want the real thing. Catch rates stay high, even as farmed alternatives become available. So the benefit exists in theory, but disappears in practice. And that's where a fast reader loses points. If you skim paragraph 4 and walk away thinking the author ended on a hopeful note, you read the first half and you missed the second. That nonetheless is doing more work than almost any other word in the passage. Now, the key move here is the give and take. Every time the passage offers a reason fish farming might help, the author pulls it away. Experts say they'll restore fisheries, no evidence. It could reduce pressure, but it creates environmental damage. It could be efficient, but the feed ratios are terrible. It could lower demand for wild fish, but niche markets keep catch rates high. The entire passage runs on this rhythm. Offer, then withdraw. If you see that pattern, you can predict what the questions are going to ask you. Now, the author, of course, thinks fish farming does more harm than good for wild fisheries. That is their opinion. The main trap is reading this as a neutral weighing of the pros and cons. And it looks that way because the author does acknowledge some benefits. But every benefit gets undercut within a few sentences. If you miss that pattern, you're going to pick answers that call the author objective or ambivalent. The author is neither one. They gave the other side a hearing and then rejected it. That's not the same thing as being undecided. Now, before you hit the questions, check yourself on 3 things. First, why does the author bring up the expert prediction about restoring fisheries if they're just going to dismiss it? Second, what is paragraph 3 really proving with all those numbers? And third, what job is the word nonetheless doing near the end of paragraph 4? So that was passage 2 in test 153. Now on to the next. This is LSAT PrepTest 153, section 1, passage 3, about accomplice witnesses and jailhouse informants, and whether the legal system actually protects against their false testimony. The difficulty level here is medium, the ideas are pretty straightforward, but the passage stacks 4 different problems on top of each other, and students will often lose track of which one they're in. Now, this is a law passage building a case. The author thinks courts are too trusting of testimony from cooperating witnesses, and every single paragraph adds a new reason why. That is the structure, layer after layer after layer after layer again. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 2. That is where the author faces the strongest pushback to the argument and then punches through it. If you misread paragraph 2, you're going to get the main point question wrong. Now, paragraph 1 is pure setup. It defines the 2 witness types and explains the deal they're getting: reduced sentences, dropped charges, whatever incentive the prosecution can offer. Then it makes the first real move. This setup creates a world where lying is almost free. One study found that informants who lie are almost never prosecuted. So the witness has everything to gain and nothing to lose. You want to read this at a normal speed because you've got to lock in the incentive problem before anything else clicks. Then paragraph 2, you want to slow way down here. It opens with what the courts believe. Courts have said the safeguards work. Cross-examination catches liars. Judge and juries can weigh witnesses' motives. Now that sounds solid, but that's the trap. Because mid-paragraph, you hit the word however, and the whole thing flips around. The author shows you a scenario that the safeguards cannot touch. Sometimes prosecutors just hint at a deal, nothing on paper, nothing official, and when that happens, the jury never finds out the witness had a reason to lie. Now, the protection the courts are so confident about, it has a hole in it. Now, here is what matters for you. The first half of this paragraph is not the author's view, it is the court's view. The author is setting it up so they can knock it down. So if you walk away thinking the author agrees the safeguards work, you're cooked. Then paragraph 3 changes direction. The author pulls in psychology research, but not about cooperating witnesses, about confessions. Studies show jurors give confessions way too much weight, even when they know the defendant was pressured into confessing. Now, why does the author care about confessions in a passage about cooperating witnesses? Because it is the same problem. If jurors can't properly discount a coerced confession, they probably can't discount incentivized testimony either. You want to watch out for the phrase particularly relevant near the end of the paragraph. That is the author waving a flag. They're telling you this is not a detour. It is the link between the psychology and the legal argument. Then paragraph 4 gives you the why behind paragraph 3. There is a known bias. People explain other people's behavior based on character, not circumstances. So when a juror hears a confession, their gut says guilty people confess. But they don't stop to ask what deal was on the table. The author's point is that the same bias kicks in with cooperating witnesses. Jurors assume the testimony is honest because they're focused on the witness's character, not on the incentive that got them to the stand. Now, this paragraph supports paragraph 3. It does not introduce a new argument. Read it carefully, but also know its job. Now, the key move is that gap in paragraph 2. The courts trust their safeguards. The author finds the one scenario those safeguards can't reach, the undisclosed deal. That is the crack in the foundation. And everything else in the passage piles weight on top of it. Now, the author's stance here is clear. The system is more vulnerable to false testimony than courts want to admit, and jurors are psychologically unequipped to fix the problem. The big trap here is treating paragraph 2 as neutral or supportive. Students see the phrase safeguards are in place and they check out. They think the author signed off, but the author didn't sign off. The author spent the rest of the paragraph explaining why those safeguards fail. If you miss that, you're going to pick the wrong answer on main point, author's attitude, and probably paragraph function questions too. Now, you should expect a question about the role of the psychology research. The wrong answer will describe it as a separate topic. The right answer will connect it back to the cooperating witness problem. Now, you should also expect something about the court's position. And the wrong answer there will blend the court's view with the author's view. Now, before you go on to the questions, check yourself on 3 things. First, why does the author bring up confession research in a passage about witness testimony? Second, what specific scenario makes the court-approved safeguards fail? And third, in the first half of paragraph 2, whose opinion are you hearing? So that was passage 3. Now on to passage 4. This is LSAT PrepTest 153, section 1, passage 4. This is a comparative or dual passage set about blues musicians versus West African griots. Difficulty is medium, and the reading is pretty straightforward, but the trap is hidden in how the two passages connect. Now, passage 1 is an argument, passage B is a description. Together, and they're making one point. Blues musicians and griots look alike on the surface, but they come from completely opposite social worlds. Start with passage A. The very first sentence sets you up to fail because it tells you what other commentators believe, that blues musicians are basically modern griots. And it sounds reasonable because the analogy is pretty straightforward, but the author immediately says no. You could hardly find two performers with less in common. And that pivot happens fast. If you miss it, you'll carry the wrong idea throughout the entire passage. The rest of paragraph 1 is all about griots. They were historians, community figures, high status. Their songs filled the role of libraries and museums. You want to read this part at normal speed because it's background, but you need it. Everything here builds the picture of a musician who is completely embedded in a functioning society. But then the author flips to blues musicians, and the energy changes completely. Blues musicians were cut off, they were isolated, and the author points straight at slavery as being the cause. Slavery destroyed the communal bonds, the traditions, the continuity that made the griot's art possible. Blues didn't grow out of tradition, it grew out of the wreckage, and that is a big distinction. Now, the last section of passage A is where most students skim, and it's exactly where you should slow down. The author says blues music sounds personal, it sounds small, everyday, individual, but that word facade tells you something deeper is going on. The personal stuff is the surface. Underneath it sits a much larger story about cultural loss. The everyday heartache in blues music carries the weight of everything that was stripped away, and that is the author's real point here. Blues music's power doesn't come from the personal details. It comes from what those details are standing in for. Now, passage B. You should read passage B faster because it's not arguing, it's laying out facts about the wall of caste system. Nobles on top, griots at the very bottom. But low status didn't mean unimportant. Griots were the only people in the culture allowed to raise their voice in public. They sang praises for their patrons. They recited family histories. They reinforced social values. Every single thing about their role was communal and embedded. Now, you want to slow down at the end of passage B because that last piece is easy to blow past. Despite being the lowest caste, griots had to be deeply tuned into Wolof values and proper conduct. They were not outsiders pushing against the system, they were holding it together from the bottom. And that detail matters for the questions. So here's where you got to spend your real thinking. How do these passages relate? The first thing you should know is they don't disagree, of course. Passage B is not pushing back on passage A, it is filling in the evidence. Every detail passage B gives you about griots, the patron relationships, the inherited service, the public role, the caste obligations, they all make passage A's contrast sharper. Griots were woven into their society at every level. Blues musicians, according to passage A, had none of that. Their music came from the absence of exactly what passage B describes. Now, of course, the questions want you to overcomplicate this. You're going to see choices that frame these as competing views, or say that both passages are making the same argument, but neither is true. Passage A argues, passage B describes. And passage B's description supports passage A's argument without ever directly referencing it. Now, the main trap is the opening of passage A. If you walk away thinking the author believes blues musicians are extensions of griots, you're going to get main point questions wrong and probably relationship questions too. That is other people's view. The author's view is the opposite. Now, the second trap is on inference questions. You might see a choice saying both types of music came from similar cultural circumstances, but that is backwards. The whole point is that griots had a rich communal structure and blues musicians didn't. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you're clear on three things. First, what destroyed the social conditions that made griot-style music possible? Second, what specific role did griots play in Wolof society? And third, what is the actual relationship between those two passages, not competing, not identical, but complementary? Now, the key move is that the first paragraph pivot in passage A The author names a popular comparison and then spends both passages pulling it apart. If you see the rejection, everything else falls into place. If you miss it, nothing else will. There you have it, folks. I will be back in a couple hours, 2 hours from now, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, for the regular daily live Q&A, anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions. I'll see you all then.